harbor's heart, stories from Erie's front porch. Well now, come on up here to the PorchTales and settle in for a spell. The sun's painting that old lake orange and pink tonight, just like it did when I was a boy running these same streets of Erie, Pennsylvania. You can smell the fresh water mixing with the scent of my neighbor, Mrs. Kolsky's pierogi, drifting through her kitchen window. And if you listen real close, you can hear the distant hum of the foundry where my daddy worked for 37 years. This is home, friend. And tonight, I want to tell you about the people who made this place and this heart of mine what it is today. If this kind of story brings back something in your heart, go ahead and subscribe to Canal PorchTales, give it a like, and share it with someone who still remembers how it used to be. Because stories like these, they're worth keeping alive, just like the spirit of this old lake town that raised me. I was 8 years old when I first understood what it meant to be from Erie.
This shirt I'm wearing, it stands for something real. It's for those who remember America's proud days, built on hard work, unity, and respect for the flag. We've got styles for men, women, and even the kids. Great quality, timeless spirit. Just point your camera at the QR code and wear what America stands for.
It was the winter of '89, and Lord, that was a winter that would have made the old lake sailors weep. Snow came down for 3 straight weeks, piling up against our front door like nature was trying to remind us who was really in charge around here. My mama was fretting because Daddy's shift at the plant had been cut short again, and the grocery money was running thin. But that's when you learn what Erie people are really made of. Old Giuseppe Torino lived next door in a house his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands back in 1923, when Italian families were flooding into Erie looking for work and a chance at the American dream. Giuseppe was 73 that winter, with hands like leather and a voice soft as Sunday morning prayers. Every day during that storm, I'd watch him from my bedroom window as he'd bundle up in that same green wool coat he'd worn for 20 years, grab his snow shovel, and work his way down our entire block, house by house, driveway by driveway, never asking for a penny or even a thank you. When Mama finally caught him clearing our walk for the 4th time that week, she marched right out there in her house slippers and that ratty old robe, grabbed that shovel from his weathered hands, and said, "Giuseppe Torino, you get yourself inside this house right now for some coffee and cornbread before you catch your death." But Giuseppe, he just smiled that gentle smile of his and said in that broken English that still carried the hills of Sicily, "Mrs. Mary, the good Lord, he gives me strong back. What am I gonna do? Watch my neighbors struggle. This is what we do here. This is Erie." And that was it, right there. That was the moment I understood that being from Erie wasn't just about where you were born or where your house sat along these lake shores. It was about showing up when the snow got too deep, when the bills got too high, when life got too hard. It was about being the kind of people who didn't wait to be asked. Down at Mickey's Diner on State Street, there was a woman named Dorothy who'd been pouring coffee and flipping eggs since before I was even a twinkle in my daddy's eye. Dorothy knew every single person who walked through that door, knew how they liked their coffee, knew their troubles, knew their joys. She was a big woman with gray hair always pulled back in a net and an apron that had seen more than its fair share of bacon grease and maple syrup. But her smile, Lord, her smile could warm you up faster than the furnace on a February morning. I remember the day Tommy Kowalski came home from Desert Storm, still wearing his uniform, still carrying that distant look in his eyes that young men get when they've seen too much too soon. His mama had been crying for months, not knowing if her boy was coming home or coming home in a box. When Tommy walked through the door of Mickey's that Tuesday morning, Dorothy took one look at him, set down her coffee pot, walked around that counter, and wrapped him up in the biggest hug this side of Lake Erie. "Welcome home, baby," she said, and there wasn't a dry eye in that place. "Your breakfast is on the house for life." That's how we did things in Erie. We took care of our own, especially the ones who'd gone off to take care of all of us. Summer was a different kind of magic in our town. When the snow finally melted and the lake thawed out, it was like the whole city exhaled this great big sigh of relief. The Polish families would set up their grills in their backyards, and the smell of kielbasa and sauerkraut would drift through the neighborhoods like incense. The Irish families would gather at the lake for their annual picnic, complete with fiddle music and enough Guinness to float a boat. And the German families, well, they'd organize everything with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. But it was the kids who really brought the summer to life. We'd spend our days down at the creek that ran behind Frontier Park, skipping stones and catching crawfish with nothing but our bare hands and mason jars we'd stolen from our mother's pantries. There was this one summer when I was 12, and my best friend Billy Morrison and I had convinced ourselves we were going to catch the biggest bass that ever swam in those Pennsylvania waters. We'd get up before dawn, grab our fishing poles, and sneak down to the water before our parents could saddle us with chores. Billy's daddy had died in a car accident the winter before, leaving Billy's mama to raise 3 kids on a waitress's salary and whatever help the church could provide. Billy never talked about it much, but you could see it in the way he held his shoulders, like he was carrying something too heavy for a 12-year-old boy. So when we'd sit there on the creek bank, lines in the water, talking about everything and nothing, I understood that this wasn't just about catching fish. This was about finding a place where the weight could rest for a while. One morning, as the mist was still rising off the water and the world was painted in those soft pastels that only come with sunrise, Billy's line went taut. I mean, his whole pole bent nearly in half, and for a second we both just stared at it like we couldn't believe our luck. Then Billy started whooping and hollering, and I was yelling right along with him, and we both knew this was it. This was the big one we'd been dreaming about all summer. It took Billy nearly 10 minutes to reel in that bass, and when he finally hauled it up onto the bank, we both just sat there staring at this beautiful, shimmering fish that had to be at least 4 pounds if it was an ounce. Billy's face was lit up like Christmas morning, and for the first time since his daddy died, I saw that weight lift off his shoulders. My dad would have loved this, he said quietly, holding that fish like it was made of gold. He always said the best fishermen were the ones who knew how to wait. We threw that bass back into the creek that day because Billy said his daddy had taught him that the biggest ones deserved to keep swimming. But I kept that moment in my heart, the way Billy's face looked when he realized that maybe, just maybe, his daddy was still there with him in all the important ways. Now, if these memories are stirring something up in your own heart, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to Canal PorchTales and share this story with folks who understand that the best parts of life aren't found in the big cities or the bright lights, but in the quiet moments between neighbors who care about each other. Because that's what this is all about, friends. That's what keeps us connected to what matters most. As I got older, I started to understand that Erie wasn't just a place on the map. It was a way of being in the world. When the steel mills started closing down in the late 80s and early 90s, when the jobs that had sustained our fathers and grandfathers began disappearing like morning fog, a lot of folks figured Erie was finished. They said we were just another Rust Belt town that had seen its best days, another casualty of progress and global economics. But they didn't know Erie people the way I knew Erie people. I watched my own daddy, who'd worked at the foundry since he was 18 years old, come home one October evening with his lunch pail in one hand and his pink slip in the other. Mama was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes and humming some old hymn when Daddy set that paper down on the counter without saying a word. She dried her hands on her apron, picked up that slip, read it twice, then set it down and wrapped her arms around the man who'd provided for us for 25 years. Well, she said, I guess we'll figure it out. We always do. And we did. Daddy started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, fixing porches and painting houses and clearing gutters for folks who remembered when he used to coach Little League and organized the volunteer fire department's annual fish fry. Within 6 months, he had more work than he could handle because people in Erie understood that a man's worth wasn't measured by where he clocked in, but by how he treated his neighbors and raised his children. The city itself started changing too, but not in the way the newspapers said it would. Instead of giving up and rolling over, Erie started fighting back with the kind of quiet determination that had carried it through the War of 1812, through the Great Depression, through all the storms that had battered its shores for more than 2 centuries. Young people who could have easily left for bigger cities and better opportunities started staying home or coming back home with ideas about coffee shops and art galleries and small businesses that could bloom right here along the lake. I remember when Sarah Chun opened her little cafe on Peach Street, right in what used to be Murphy's hardware store. Sarah was a Penn State Barron graduate who could have taken her business degree anywhere in the country, but she said she wanted to build something in a place where people would know her name and her story. The old-timers were skeptical at first, wondering what a young Chinese-American woman could possibly know about serving good coffee to Erie folks. But Sarah had grown up here too, had played in the same parks and gone to the same schools, and when she started serving her grandmother's dumplings alongside her expertly crafted lattes, well, it didn't take long for word to spread. Within a year, Sarah's Cafe had become the unofficial town hall for a whole new generation of Erie dreamers. Artists and musicians and small business owners would gather around those mismatched tables Sarah had rescued from estate sales, planning festivals and farmers markets and community gardens that would bring new life to old neighborhoods. But they did it all with respect for what had come before, understanding that progress doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. I was 25 when I met the woman who would become my wife, and she wasn't even from Erie originally. Rebecca had grown up in Pittsburgh, which to us lake folks might as well have been a foreign country. But she'd come to Erie to work as a social worker, helping resettle refugees who'd fled wars and violence in places most of us could barely pronounce. She told me later that she'd planned to stay just 2 years, long enough to get some experience and pad her resume, before moving on to something bigger and more important. But Erie has a way of getting into your blood if you give it half a chance. Rebecca's first case was a Somali family, a mother and 3 children who'd lived in refugee camps for almost a decade before finally making it to America. They spoke no English, had never seen snow, had never experienced the kind of cold that comes off Lake Erie in January. The father had died during their journey, leaving Amina to raise her children in a place where nothing was familiar, nothing was certain. Rebecca spent that first winter teaching Amina how to use the thermostat, how to shop at the grocery store, how to navigate the bus system so her children could get to school. But it was the Erie community that really embraced this family and made them feel at home. Mrs. Kowalski, Giuseppe's daughter-in-law, showed up at their apartment with a pot of soup and stayed to teach Amina how to use the stove. The kids on their block taught Amina's children how to build snowmen and throw snowballs. And before long, you couldn't tell the difference between the refugee kids and the ones who'd been born here. That's when Rebecca understood what I'd known my whole life. Erie doesn't just make you tougher, it makes you kinder. It teaches you that everyone's fighting some kind of battle, and the least you can do is offer to carry part of the load. We got married on a Saturday in June, right there in Peninsula Park with the lake stretching out behind us like a blue promise. Giuseppe Torino, who was pushing 80 by then, insisted on playing his accordion during the ceremony, and Dorothy from Mickey's Diner made our wedding cake. A 3-layer masterpiece covered in buttercream roses that tasted like pure love. The whole neighborhood showed up, bringing covered dishes and folding chairs and enough stories to fill a library. During our first dance, as the sun was setting over the water and fireflies were starting to blink in the trees, Rebecca whispered in my ear, "I get it now. I understand why you never wanted to leave this place." And I knew right then that Erie had claimed another heart, had added another story to its collection of people who'd found their home along these shores. Our children were born into this community of extended family and honorary aunts and uncles who'd known them before they took their first breath. Our son Michael came into the world during a November snowstorm, with half the neighborhood waiting in the hospital lobby and the other half at home cooking meals to stock our freezer for the next month. Our daughter Emma arrived on the 4th of July during Erie's annual Independence Day celebration, and old Giuseppe swore it was a sign that she'd grow up to be a patriot and a fighter. Watching our children grow up in Erie was like watching the best parts of my own childhood played out in high definition. They learned to fish in the same creek where Billy Morrison and I had spent our summers. They learned about community service by helping Rebecca and the refugee families who continued to arrive in our city, drawn by word-of-mouth reports that Erie was a place where strangers became neighbors, where different became beautiful. Michael, who inherited his mama's heart for justice and his daddy's love for this old lake town, started volunteering at the community center when he was just 14, teaching English to newly arrived families and organizing soccer games that brought together kids from Somalia, Sudan, Nepal, Syria, and good old Pennsylvania. Watching him navigate between languages and cultures with the same ease his grandfather had shown navigating the neighborhood with his snow shovel, I knew Erie was in good hands for another generation. Emma, with her artist's eye and her grandmother's stubborn streak, started a mural project when she was 16, painting the sides of buildings throughout the city with scenes that celebrated Erie's past while imagining its future. Her masterpiece covered the entire south wall of what used to be the old Kohler Brewery, showing the lake in all 4 seasons, with faces of every color and age looking out over the water with hope and determination. The older I got, the more I understood that Erie's real strength wasn't in its industries or its location or even its beautiful lake. Erie's strength was in its people's ability to adapt, to endure, to find ways to take care of each other no matter what storms came rolling in off the water. When the opioid crisis hit our community like so many others across America, we didn't just wring our hands and blame outside forces. We opened treatment centers, started support groups, created job training programs for people trying to rebuild their lives. When the 2016 election election divided the country into red and blue tribes, Erie found ways to stay purple, to remember that neighbors don't stop being neighbors just because they vote differently. At Mickey's Diner, Dorothy's daughter Linda, who'd taken over the business, posted a sign that read, "All viewpoints welcome, all hatred checked at the door, all coffee served with respect." And somehow it worked. Somehow, people kept coming together over eggs and bacon and the shared understanding that life's too short and Erie's too small for permanent enemies. I was 53 when Giuseppe Torino passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in March, dying peacefully in his sleep after 8 decades of showing this community what it meant to be a good neighbor. The funeral procession stretched for 12 blocks, from St. Paul's Catholic Church all the way to Calvary Cemetery, with people walking behind the hearse in a silent tribute to a man who'd spent his life making other people's lives a little bit easier. At the graveside service, his grandson Tony, who'd become a teacher at East High School, read a letter Giuseppe had written to be opened after his death. In it, he thanked Erie for giving his family a home, for accepting an immigrant boy who'd arrived with nothing but hope and a willingness to work. But more than that, he challenged all of us to keep alive the spirit of community that had sustained him through 80 years of American life. Erie is not just place, Tony read in his grandfather's voice. Erie is promise. Promise that if you work hard, if you treat people good, if you never forget where you come from, you can build something beautiful that lasts longer than your own life. You can leave world a little bit better than you found it. Standing there in that cemetery, surrounded by 5 generations of Erie families who'd gathered to honor one old man's example, I felt the weight and the privilege of carrying that promise forward. Because that's what we do in Erie. We remember our stories, we honor our dead, and we keep building something beautiful for the children who haven't even been born yet. Now, as I sit here on this porch, watching the sun paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I think about all the stories this old town has collected over the years. Stories of immigrants who became Americans, of workers who became entrepreneurs, of strangers who became family. Stories of children who grew up to be teachers and artists and social workers and small business owners, carrying forward the values they learned on these streets, in these neighborhoods, from people like Giuseppe and Dorothy and my own mama and daddy. Erie, Pennsylvania, isn't perfect. We've got our problems, our challenges, our heartaches, just like any place else. The winters are still too long, the summers too short, and the lake effect snow can still bury your car faster than you can dig it out. But we've also got something that's getting harder to find in this fast-moving digital world. We've got each other. We've got neighbors who know your name and remember your birthday. We've got coffee shops where they know how you like your coffee and diners where they know your story. We've got kids who still play outside until the streetlights come on, and adults who still believe in the power of community to solve problems and heal wounds. If you've been listening to this old story of mine and feeling something stirring in your chest, something that remembers or longs for this kind of life, I hope you'll subscribe to Canal PorchTales, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and maybe take a moment to think about your own community, your own neighbors, your own chances to shovel a sidewalk or buy a stranger coffee, or simply show up when life gets too heavy for someone to carry alone. Because in the end, that's what Erie taught me, and that's what I want to pass on to anyone who's willing to listen. We're all in this together, whether we want to be or not. The question isn't whether we'll face storms, it's whether we'll face them alone or surrounded by people who've decided that your struggle is their struggle, your joy is their joy, your story is part of their story. The sun's almost gone now, disappear behind the horizon like a promise to return tomorrow. The lake is settling into that perfect stillness that comes just before dark, reflecting the first few stars like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, I can hear the whistle of the Norfolk Southern train carrying freight from Chicago to New York, the same sound that's marked time in this city for more than a century and a half. In a few minutes, I'll go inside to help Rebecca with dinner, and we'll sit around the table with our grown children and maybe a grandchild or two, sharing food and stories and laughter that echoes through these rooms like music. And tomorrow morning, I'll wake up in the same town where I was born, surrounded by people who knew my parents and remember my children as babies, carrying forward the same promise Giuseppe Torino understood when he was a young man with strong hands and a willingness to help his neighbors. This is Erie, Pennsylvania. This is home. This is what it looks like when people decide that community matters more than convenience, when they choose connection over comfort, when they understand that the best parts of America aren't found in the headlines or the history books, but in the quiet moments between neighbors who care about each other enough to show up, shovel the walk, and keep the coffee warm. But let me tell you about the time Erie really showed me what it was made of, because there's more to this story than just snow shoveling and coffee shops. It was the summer of 2008, when the economic crash hit this country like a sledgehammer to the chest, and folks around here were already struggling from years of plant closures and job losses. That's when I learned that surviving hard times and thriving through them are two entirely different things. The Kowalski family had been running their small grocery store on East 26th Street for 43 years, serving the Polish-American neighborhood with imported sausages, fresh rye bread, and the kind of personal service that meant they'd deliver groceries to Mrs. Nowak when her arthritis was acting up, or let the Henderson kids trade bottle returns for penny candy when their mama was between paychecks. But when the recession hit and people started shopping at the big box stores to save every possible dollar, Stan Kowalski found himself staring at shelves that were getting emptier and books that were bleeding red ink. I remember the day Stan came into Sarah Chen's cafe. His shoulders slumped like he was carrying the weight of 4 decades worth of dreams. Sarah took one look at him, poured him a cup of her strongest coffee, and sat down across from him at that corner table with a morning light filtered through her grandmother's lace curtains. "What's eating at you, Stan?" she asked, and something in her voice made it clear she had all day to listen. Stan told her about the store, about the debt that was piling up faster than Lake Erie's snow, about the sleepless nights wondering if he'd have to break the news to his employees that there wouldn't be paychecks come Friday. He talked about his father, who'd started the business with nothing but a pushcart and a dream, and how Stan felt like he was failing not just his family, but his whole community. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way people in Erie learn to do, and when Stan finally finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to Rebecca, who connected her with the refugee families who shopped at Stan's store, because he was one of the few grocers who carried the rice and spices they needed for their traditional meals. Then to Father McKenna at St. Stanislaus, who knew every Polish family in a 6-block radius. Then to Tommy Kowalski, Stan's nephew who'd come home from Iraq and was working as a mechanic while trying to figure out what came next. Within a week, something beautiful started happening. It started small, the way most beautiful things do in Erie. Mrs. Kowalski began hosting cooking classes in the back room of the store, teaching young mothers how to make proper pierogi and galumpki the way their grandmothers had. The refugee women started bringing their own recipes to share, and before long, Thursday evenings at Kowalski's had become a United Nations of comfort food, with Somali sambusas sitting next to Polish cabbage rolls, and Syrian mamul cookies sharing space with German strudel. Tommy had the idea to start a delivery service for elderly residents, using his pickup truck and his military discipline to make sure no one in the neighborhood went without groceries. But it wasn't just about delivery. Tommy would sit with old Mr. Kowalski for a few minutes, listening to stories about the war, or help Mrs. Grabowski change a light bulb while he was bringing her weekly shopping. The elderly customers started looking forward to Tommy's visits as much as they looked forward to their groceries, and word spread through the senior community that Kowalski's wasn't just a store, it was a lifeline. Sarah organized a Shop Local Saturdays campaign, convincing other small business owners to offer special deals if customers showed receipts from their neighbors' stores. Giuseppe's grandson Tony, the teacher, brought his high school business class to Kowalski's to help Stan set up a simple website and social media presence. The students created a blog called Stories from the Store, featuring recipes, neighborhood history, and profiles of longtime customers that made people feel like they were part of something bigger than just buying groceries. But the moment I knew Erie was going to save Kowalski's came on a rainy Tuesday in October, when I stopped by to pick up some of Mrs. Kowalski's fresh bread. The store was packed, which was unusual for a weekday afternoon, and it took me a few minutes to realize what was happening. The refugee families were there, but so were the descendants of the original Polish immigrants, and the Irish families from down by the bay, and the African American families from the east side, and the young professionals who'd moved to the waterfront condos. They weren't just shopping, they were talking. Kids were running between the aisles while their mothers compared recipes in 3 different languages. Teenagers were helping elderly customers reach items on high shelves. Stan was behind the counter with the biggest smile I'd seen on his face in months, ringing up sales and accepting compliments on his wife's homemade soup with the pride of a man who remembered why he'd fallen in love with this business in the first place. "You know what happened here?" Rebecca asked me that night as we were getting ready for bed. People remembered that supporting your neighbors isn't charity, it's community. It's understanding that when Stan succeeds, when his business thrives, when his family can pay their bills and sleep at night, all of us are stronger. And she was right. Kowalski's didn't just survive the recession, it thrived. Stan expanded the store, adding a small cafe area where the cooking classes evolved into a weekly community dinner that brought together people who might never have met otherwise. The delivery service grew into a neighborhood institution, with Tommy eventually hiring hiring 3 other veterans to help him serve not just the elderly, but busy families and anyone who needed a helping hand. Years later, when food writers from Pittsburgh and Cleveland started visiting Erie to write about our emerging food scene, they always ended up at Kowalski's trying to understand how a small neighborhood grocery store had become the heart of a community renaissance. But those of us who lived it knew the secret wasn't complicated. We'd simply remembered that in a world that seemed to be pulling apart at the seams, we could choose to weave ourselves back together, one relationship at a time, one shared meal at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The lake taught us that lesson too, in its own way. Every spring, when the ice finally broke up and drifted out toward the deeper water, it wasn't one big dramatic moment. It was thousands of small cracks, millions of tiny shifts, water finding its way through frozen barriers until suddenly, impossibly, the whole lake was free and flowing again. That's how change happens in Erie. Not with grand gestures or outside intervention, but with neighbors deciding to care about each other, one conversation at a time, one shared struggle at a time, one common dream at a time. I think about this a lot now, especially when I watch the news and hear about all the ways our country seems divided, all the anger and fear and mistrust that's poisoning our national conversation. Because here in Erie, we've got Trump voters and Biden voters sitting at the same table at Kowalski's community dinners. We've got families who've been here for 5 generations working alongside families who arrived last year. We've got Christians and Muslims and people who don't claim any faith at all united by the understanding that their children are playing together, their neighbors are watching out for each other, and their community is stronger when everyone has a seat at the table. It's not that we don't have disagreements or tensions or problems. Lord knows we do, but we've learned that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, that different doesn't have to mean dangerous, that you can love your community without hating the communities around you. We've learned that the antidote to fear is not more fear, but more connection. More stories shared across kitchen tables, more hands extended in times of trouble, more reasons to believe that we're all in this together. My grandson Alexander, Michael's boy, is 7 years old now, and he's growing up in an Erie that's both exactly the same and completely different from the one I knew as a child. He still catches fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings, still builds snowmen in the front yard when the lake affects snow starts flying. But his best friends include Amara, whose family came from Somalia, and David, whose parents moved here from Nepal, and Maria, whose grandmother speaks only Spanish but makes the best tamales this side of Texas. Alexander doesn't see anything unusual about this. To him, it's just normal that his classmates speak different languages at home, practice different traditions, tell different stories about the places their families came from. He's learning that diversity isn't something to be tolerated or managed or overcome, but something to be celebrated and shared and woven into the fabric of what makes Erie special. Last month, Alexander's class put on a presentation about the history of Erie, and each child was supposed to research and share the story of how their family came to live here. Alexander stood up in front of the whole school and told the story of his great-great-grandfather, who'd worked in the foundries and shoveled his neighbors' walks every winter. But then Amara told the story of her grandmother's journey from war-torn Somalia to the shores of Lake Erie, and David talked about his parents' decision to leave the mountains of Nepal for the promise of American education and opportunity. As I sat in that elementary school auditorium, listening to 7-year-olds tell the stories of immigration and hope and resilience that had built our community over more than 2 centuries, I realized that Erie's greatest strength had always been its ability to make room. Room for one more family, one more story, one more dream of what America could be when people decided to care about each other more than they cared about their differences. The applause that filled that auditorium when the children finished their presentations wasn't polite or obligatory. It was the sound of a community recognizing itself, celebrating its past, while embracing its future, understanding that the best of Erie had always been about making space for whoever was brave enough or desperate enough or hopeful enough to call this place home. These days when people ask me what it's like to live in Erie, I tell them it's like living in a story that's still being written, where every day brings a chance to add a new chapter, introduce a new character, discover a new plot twist that makes the whole narrative richer and more complex and more beautiful than it was the day before. We're not a perfect community, and we're not a finished community, but we're a community that believes in the power of showing up, speaking up, and refusing to give up on the idea that we can build something together that's bigger and better than anything we could build alone. The evening air is getting cooler now, carrying the first hint of autumn and the promise of another winter that will test our resolve and strengthen our bonds. In a few weeks, the leaves will start turning those brilliant reds and golds that make Lake Erie look like it's surrounded by fire. The children will go back to school, carrying lunchboxes packed with love and stories that span continents. The refugees who arrived this year will face their first Erie winter, supported by neighbors who remember their own family's first encounters with lake-effect snow and bitter cold. Stan Kowalski will stock his shelves with comfort food for the long months ahead, and Sarah Chun will switch from iced coffee to hot cider, and Tommy Kowalski will make sure his delivery truck is ready for the snow and his elderly customers have everything they need to weather whatever storms come rolling off the lake. Dorothy's daughter Linda will serve countless cups of coffee to folks who need a warm place to sit and talk through whatever's troubling them. And Father McKenna will open the church doors to anyone who needs shelter from a cold. And through it all, the lake will be there, constant and changing, rough and calm, frozen and flowing, reminding us that resilience isn't about avoiding the storms, but about learning to dance with them, to bend without breaking, to find ways to stay warm and keep each other safe until the ice melts and the water flows free again. This is Erie, Pennsylvania, in all its complicated, beautiful, stubborn, generous glory. This is what it looks like when people decide that home isn't just a place on the map, but a commitment to each other, a promise to keep showing up, a faith that tomorrow can be better than today if we're willing to work for it together. Come back anytime, friend. The porch light will be on, the coffee will be hot, and there's always room for one more story around this table where love lives and community grows stronger with every season that passes. Because that's what we do here in Erie. We make room, we make time, we make a difference, and we make sure that no one has to face the storms alone.